Hey there, how's it going? Tonight I'm playing around with the DJI OSMO Action. Now you probably know this as a really good action camera and quite a good vlogging camera with this awesome front screen on the front of it, but it does a hell of a lot more than that, as I've been finding out. It's got really good long exposure stuff and also the ability to do time lapses at night with long exposure as well. So I thought I'd have a bit of a play around with them. So here we have the DJI OSMO Action. Now it turns out this thing, as well as being the great action cam, is also really good at taking long exposure shots and also long exposure time-lapse shots, which means it's great for stellar photography, which is what I've just been doing outside over the last hour or so. I took this thing outside, I did a couple of long exposure shots with it, and I'll show you how to set that up now and the shots that I got. So here's the OSMO Action. I'll just power that on first. Now, as always, it comes up in video mode, and what I want to do now is go out and get some photos. So I'm just going to change that to photo mode by tapping down on the icon here and then photo at the top, and that brings me into photo mode, so I can just swipe up to get rid of that. Now what I want to do is change the exposure on it. I'm going to change it by sliding from the right hand side there from auto exposure to manual exposure, and already it's set on 100 ISO, so I'm going to leave that there, and the shutter speed is set at 1/100th of a second. I want to change the shutter speed in particular, so I'll tap on that and it brings up this nice slidey menu on the side here. I'm just going to scroll that up until I can change the shutter speed to 1/20th of a second. Now that's getting a bit hard to see on the side there, so I'll just move something dark in front of the scroll bar. There we go, Osmo Pocket, really useful accessory for the Osmo Action when you want to see the menu. So that's a 3 second, 5 second, 6, 13 second, and there we go. That's a I'll set that to a 30 second exposure time. And that's pretty much as simple as it is. I can just tap away there. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this outside with that exposure setting on it. I'm going to put it on top of a large light stand which sits about 4.8 meters up in the air, and I'm just going to use the mount that I've got on it here, and I'll bend that right back so it's facing directly upwards, and I can remote connect to it with the Memo app on the iPhone and trigger the photo from there and take a couple of them, change the settings. I'm going to do a few different settings to experiment with it, different exposure times, and maybe play with the ISO a little bit, and this is what's coming out of it. So here's the first photo taken with an ISO of 100 and the shutter speed of 30 seconds. It's got a lot of detail in it. In this next one I opened the ISO up to 200 and left the shutter speed at 30 seconds. As you can see, there's a bit more detail in it, but I was also getting some light bleed from around the area I was in. In this third photo I moved the ISO back to 100 and increased the shutter time to 45 seconds. Just wanted to see what would happen there if I would get more detail in. As you can see, what I did is I got rid of noise, but it increased a bit of motion blur on the stars themselves. And finally, on this fourth one, where I actually increased the exposure time quite a bit more, you can see quite a lot more motion blur. So what I would like to do is go and shoot somewhere with a higher ISO and less ambient light. Okay, so that was pretty straightforward, and we got some pretty good photos out of that. In fact, it was quite surprisingly good, the amount of detail you saw in the starscape there. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go outside and do a similar sort of thing, but this time with some video. Now here's how I set that up. So here we are again, and I'm going to switch this back now to the video mode over here. And I'm going to change to time-lapse mode, which is this one here. Okay, and I'm going to set the exposure, same sort of thing, but in time-lapse mode. Now to get my time-lapse shot, I've decided I want to shoot 4 frames a minute. To do that, I need to set the exposure time, the shutter time, to less than 15 seconds. So if I go manual mode here, I leave that on 100 ISO, and I can change the shutter speed here to 15 seconds or less. Actually, it's going to have to be less than 15 seconds. So here we go, and I'll just put my trusty Osmo light blocker back in here again, and I will set that at, what have we got here, 6, 7, 13, 9, 10, 13, 15. Okay, so if I want it to be less than quarter of a minute, that's going to have to be 13 seconds. So that's the exposure time I'm going to set here. Okay, I'll click away from that, and then what I can do is I can swipe up from the bottom here, and I can choose 15-second interval for the frames. So it's going to take a photo every 15 seconds, and it's going to take that photo for 13 seconds each time. The next thing I'm going to do is set the duration of how long I want my bit of footage to be. I'm going to film for 1 hour, which will give me 8 seconds of footage. I'll just lift that up so you can see it closer. So there you can see I'm shooting for 1 hour at 15-second intervals, and that's going to give me 8 seconds of footage over 1 hour. It does, of course, sound like not very much for a whole hour's shooting just to get 8 hours of footage, but let's have a look and see what we got out of it. Now, I only did this once, of course, because it took a whole hour just to get this 8 seconds of footage, but I think it came out quite well. It's definitely something I'm going to play around with a lot more, but this is enough for purposes of here. Quite nice video footage. And so there you go. I thought that was quite spectacular, especially for a little camera with a tiny little lens on it. These things just continue to surprise me all the time. Anyway, I hope that's been useful to you. If it has and it's been interesting, you want to see more stuff like this, hit the subscribe button down here and go ahead and watch this video and this video right now, because Google said there are stuff that you're into, and I'll see you tomorrow.